Hi, everybody. And we're getting toward the end of this workshop, and we're looking this time at the kids we really worry about, the ones who struggle to read. And we worry about them, but I think it's real important to recognize that for them, struggling to read can also be pretty darn scary. So let's look at that. First of all, there's lots of readers who struggle. It's not just a few. According to the 2013 NAEP results, 32% of tested fourth graders read below the basic level. And that included 50% of African American students and 47%, so just about half of minority students. Only 34% of students read at the proficient level or above, which is kind of where you need to be. And the situation got a little better, but not a lot better in 8th grade and 12th grade. 22% of tested 8th graders and 25% of 12th graders still read below the basic level. Okay, and it's not real good with adults either. It's not like people gradually get better and make it. The 2012 PIAAC Survey of Adult Skills, which was an international test through the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. In the US, approximately 43 million US adults, 18% of them, read at a measured level 1 out of 5 or below. And 125 million, over half of US adults tested, did not read well enough to understand and draw reasonable conclusions from a multi-paragraph newspaper story written at the 8th grade level. So maybe that explains a little bit about what's going on in the current political campaign. I don't know. But definitely, reading is a struggle for a lot of people. Now, we start looking at why. And there's a lot of reasons, and honestly, every struggling reader has a different constellation, but let's look at three that are real common. First of all, many readers, and you noticed back there that African American readers and Hispanic American readers had a much larger percentage of kids in the fourth grade who weren't even reaching basic levels. And that's because the culture of their home and the culture of their school are not matching. And we don't always think of culture. I mean, we do think of language, like, okay, the kid speaks Spanish, so fine, that's why it's hard for him to read in English. But we don't often think about culture as a reason for literacy struggles, but there are a lot of ways that culture can affect learning and literacy, and let's just look at a couple of them. First of all, and probably the number one biggest one, is prior knowledge and experiences. You can't understand what you read if what you're reading wouldn't make sense to you if you heard it. In other words, if your prior experiences, the knowledge you already have, doesn't equip you to understand what you're reading, it's not going to make sense to you. You may even be able to decode all the words, but it still won't make much sense. And I know we've all had this experience, like if I try to read something that's very deeply scientific, okay, I just don't know enough to understand it. I can maybe read all the words, but I'm sitting there going, wait a minute, what does that mean? And of course, your prior knowledge and experiences have a lot to do with the vocabulary that you have. But also, even when you're reading fiction, if it describes a life that is very different from your own, if you're not used to that, then the story is not going to make any sense to you. You're not going to understand what they're up to. Dick Anderson did a really wonderful study many years ago. I think it was in the 60s, where he had Americans read a passage about an Indian wedding, a wedding in India, and then Indian people from India read a passage about an American wedding. And they both could read the passages. They were translated passages, but they didn't understand them. Because, for example, in the American wedding, it said that the bride's dress was her grandmother's dress that her grandmother had worn at her wedding. And the people who read that from India said, oh, it was too bad the bride was so poor she had to wear a used dress. And then in the India wedding passage, there was something about they hoped that the groom's family would not want a motorcycle. And the Americans couldn't make any sense out of that at all. Why would, you know, why would the groom's family want a motorcycle, and what would that have to do with a wedding? Because they don't know anything about the tradition in India that the bride's family pays a dowry of very expensive gifts, if they're a fairly well-off family, to the groom's family. So you can see how you can read something, but if it's way outside of your experience, it doesn't make sense to you. And especially if you're a kid, you don't really know that other people live very different lives. So you or I could read historical fiction or fiction from another country, and it might not totally make sense to us, but we'd know why. But kids don't. They just sort of shake their heads. It's like, well, this isn't making any sense to me. I can't read it. So that's the biggest one, I would say, number one. Okay, but also different cultures have different communication and behavioral norms, different ideas about how people should talk to each other and how people should act around each other. And if you don't think this is true, if you come from the South, ask one of your northern friends what happens if you say yes ma'am to a teacher in school. Because I can tell you what happens. You get sent to the principal's office, which if you're a southerner listening to this right now, you think that's crazy. No, in the North, if you say yes ma'am, it's assumed that you're being sassy. It's assumed that you're going, yes, ma'am, because that's not a normal communication norm up there. And there's a million other of these little misunderstandings. Well, when kids have continual misunderstandings between themselves and their teachers, they don't learn well, do they? Not to mention dialect and language differences. And one of the optional articles that you have for this week, you will notice this week when you look at the instructions that I'm only asking you to watch a very short video and read the 2 articles on your special population, the one I give you and the one you find. And it might not be an article, it might be a video or website or whatever. But I don't want to overload you this weekend. I want you to be able to think about your project and your special population. So there's a lot of great optionals that if you have any chance to get to them, please do. And one of the great optionals is an article called "Why is this child so rude?" And if I could share one article about cultural differences with teachers, that's the one I'd share. And it's in your group of things to share with teachers, because it talks about how kids from different cultures, different family groups, different all kinds of things, have different ideas about what correct behavior is. And it leads to a lot of misunderstandings in school. And reading that article really opens people's eyes to, hey, wait a minute, maybe that kid isn't being rude. Maybe they're just different. Okay? Another thing that's very, very common is that different cultures have different expectations and values and goals. So there's a whole culture in rural Georgia here that doesn't want kids sitting inside reading all day. And my family, when I grew up, was a little bit like that too. I'd be sitting inside reading on a sunny summer day, and my mom would say, "Get out of here, go out and play, get out of the house. Why are you just sitting in your room?" Okay, so I still sat in my room and read because I was one of those kids, or I took my book outside and read. But a lot of kids and a lot of families, it is much more valued to be outside either playing or working than it is to be sitting down and reading. Reading isn't seen as work, and for some families, it's not even seen as ordinary recreation. Okay, so their values and goals mitigate against that child acquiring good literacy. Also, in some cultures, girls are not expected to go very far in school. In fact, in Hispanic cultures, even today, in the immigrant Hispanic cultures, sometimes fairly young girls of 11 or 12 or 13, will be kept home from school to take care of younger children so that the parents can work. And that's just a normal thing in their culture. But for us, it's like, oh my God, she's truant, she's missing school, she's never going to pass the tests. You can see how those cultural differences are causing a problem. Of course, there's also the fact that minority or non-mainstream, or however you want to call it, cultures in our society do not have equal access to resources. And one of the optional articles that you'll probably want to read later by Newman and Solano talks about the idea that poor kids, they don't have the same resources available even in their neighborhoods. The branches in the big cities, the branches of the same library system in the poorer neighborhoods have half as many books, and they're much older books. They don't have as much tech, even though it's the same city library system, same taxpayer base, because they don't agitate for it and people don't give it. We all know that the schools in poor areas have many, now Title I helps, but it doesn't help if the school's falling apart, and it doesn't help with, outdated infrastructure, and it doesn't help with a whole lot of stuff. And so Newman and Solano are arguing that for poor kids and minority kids, let's not just level the playing field, let's tip it so that they can reach up to where other people have gotten. And so society simply doesn't give the same resources to every cultural group. And society also limits cultural groups as to the roles they're expected to play. And I know that you have all heard fellow teachers, unfortunately, say things like, well, what can you expect of kids from blank? And if you're in a rural county, you'll hear, well, what can you expect of these kids from our county? I mean, their families never get anywhere. They never get anywhere. They're just a little small town. They're just hicks. That's a horrible thing to say. But if you're from a city school, you'll hear the same thing. What can you expect from these kids? The way they're raised, the way their families are. We have discriminatory ideas about the potential of children. And the children themselves tend to limit their expectations and options. So kids will say, people like me don't go to college. Kids like me aren't ever the spelling bee winners. People in my family don't read. We don't get far in school. We're not very good at school. You'll hear stuff like that. So it's both society discriminating and also kids limiting themselves. If you're in a small town and you look around and anybody who's really made it has left, then you think, well, what could I do? What could I be? Could I really go to University of Georgia or beyond? I mean, let's hit for Harvard, guys. Where are my possibilities? And the same thing if you're in a poor neighborhood in a city. You look around and everybody around you is struggling to make it. Well, it's real hard to believe that you can go further, isn't it? And of course, as we pointed out, there's the perceptions and responses of peers and teachers and other people at school. And so it's mostly, but not completely, about mismatches between the culture of the home and the culture of the school that can affect learning and literacy, and learning of all kinds, but literacy being foundational, that's where it hits first. Now, another reason, and we've kind of hit on this a little bit, is poverty. Poverty affects all types of learning, but especially affects literacy. And here are some details from 2014, which is the latest census data available. In 2014, almost 15% of people in the country lived in poverty, which is defined as an income under $24,000 for a family of 4. And of course, it's less for a family of 3 and 2 and 1. Okay. But poverty is not evenly distributed, even though all different kinds of people live in poverty, as you can see from this many faces of poverty thing. It's not evenly distributed. 10% of white people live in poverty, 26% of black people live in poverty, and just about 24% of Hispanics do. Approximately 10% of people living in poverty live in families with at least one full-time working adult. And that's where you're hearing all the talk in the elections on both sides about income inequality, wealth inequality. And one of, again, the optional things you could look at, but it's one of the ones I've highlighted. I would strongly recommend you look at. It's a 6-minute video. It's called Wealth Inequality in America. And it was made, I believe, 4 years ago. Maybe 5. It was made quite a few years ago, and it's only gotten worse, not better. And it's an amazing video. It's, again, something that I would share with any teacher, anybody who wants to understand why we're having so much trouble with poverty in America. This is one of the reasons. And it's just plain old statistics. It's no opinions, it's just statistics. But even when you have one working adult, 10% of those people in poverty live in a family with one full-time working adult. You can work full-time and still not make enough to feed a family. Okay, 21% of children under 18, that's 15.5 million children, live in poverty. Again, however, it's not evenly distributed. And these are figures from 2013 because they didn't have the 2014 ones in yet. 10% of the children in married coupled families live in poverty. 46% of the children in single female-headed families live in poverty. So again, there's an unevenness of distribution, isn't there? In 2013, according to the Census Bureau, 21% of children lived in what they called food insecure households. A food insecure household is a household where at some point during the month there is not enough food for everyone in the household to eat normally the way you and I would think of. 10% of children in the country in 2013 had no health insurance. 40+%, over 40% of households with children reported significant housing problems, and that was again 2013. These details are 2013, okay? And what significant housing problems were? Housing that was unsafe due to lead, due to plumbing problems, due to actual roofing and leaking and stuff like that. Housing that cost more than 30% of their income. So they're paying so much in rent that there's not that much, or sometimes mortgage, but much more often rent, that there's not that much left over, okay? Or housing in neighborhoods that were deemed unsafe, not by the people living there, but by the police, okay? And in 2013, over 300,000 children were homeless at some time during the year in this country. Back to 2014, okay, I said almost 15% of the people in the country lived in poverty, okay? 21, that's 1 out of every 5 children. So if you're looking at a classroom of 25 kids, you got 5 kids probably in poverty. Of course, we all know it doesn't go by averages, but still, think about that. Okay, but 10% of children in this country in 2014, 1 out of every 10 kids lived in families who had incomes less than half of the poverty level. And believe me, if you're at less than half of the poverty level, you're trying to live on $12,000 a year for a family of 4, you're not living good. Okay. Let's take a small peek at Georgia, because Georgia sure hasn't escaped this problem. 26% of children in Georgia in 2014 lived in families that were earning below the poverty level. 12% lived in families earning less than half of the poverty level. 32% lived in families that qualified for some form of public assistance, not private charitable assistance, but government assistance during the year. And 8% of the children in Georgia had no health insurance of any kind during the year. Not Medicaid, not Peach Care, nothing. Okay, why are we talking about this in literacy? Well, because basically poverty, low income, is the #1 correlation with not learning to read very well. Kids in poverty, on average, don't learn to read very well. Now, I say on average because it's really important to point out that any one kid in poverty might be an awesome reader, okay? But on average, poverty depresses reading levels. And here's a table from the US 2013 data again, from the NAEP, which is our most recent correlation between the census and the NAEP, okay? Look at these differences here. This is pretty amazing. Free and reduced eligible kids, only 20% scored proficient or higher in 4th grade. Almost half were below basic in 4th grade. Look at the reversal here. Kids that are not free and reduced lunch eligible, over half scored proficient or higher, and only 17% were below basic. So it's kind of reversed in 4th grade, and that's where you see it strongest. But in 8th grade, okay, you're still looking at 34% of free and reduced lunch kids that are below basic. In 12th grade, 38% are below basic, but not free and reduced lunch kids, only 13 and 18%. Now that's not good. I don't like 13 or 18%, but it's a lot better than 34 and 38, isn't it? And proficient, 1 in 5 kids, all the way up, of free and reduced eligible kids reach proficient in this country. And proficient is where you have to be able to handle any kind of a job that requires literacy skills, to be able to go to college. We're getting there with 1 in 5 of the kids who are free and reduced lunch eligible. And it's about half, give or take a little, of the other kids. So it's not great with the other kids, but it's really bad with free and reduced, isn't it? Okay, why? Why should poverty affect literacy? Why should being poor make you a bad reader? Well, because poverty, especially in childhood, I really want to discriminate here. I'm not talking about being broke. You and I, or at least I don't know about you, but I have definitely been broke. Okay, when I was first married, we moved up onto 50 bare acres in northern Wisconsin in an 8x40 trailer. We didn't have a septic system for a year. We didn't have a well for a month. We were living on $500 a month. We were broke, but we weren't poor. I had a master's degree. My husband at that time had enormous skills. He could fix anything. We both had parents that, if worse came to worse, would back us up. In fact, Jim's dad gave us an old car, and my parents didn't loan us any money then, but had to a little bit later. But so we weren't poor. We were just temporarily broke. Okay, but poverty, especially in childhood, poverty impacts physical health. Poverty leads to poor nutrition because nutritious food is much more expensive. You've noticed at the grocery store, you can buy a lot of cheap, filling, lousy food. It's harder to buy fresh vegetables and good meat. Bad medical care, not only because you don't have insurance, but because a lot of doctors don't take CHIP, S-CHIP, or Medicaid. And also, in poor neighborhoods, the doctors that you can get to are usually not as good. And you get unsafe surroundings, physical health. Not just gunshots, there's a lot of that, drug abuse everywhere, but also poor neighborhoods are where you get a lot more pollution, you get lead paint in houses, all of these things that make kids in physically poor health. Well, if you're in physically bad health, if you feel sick, if you have an earache, if your teeth hurt, and boy, that's a biggie for dental care, okay, you're not going to learn to read very well, are you? And poor physical health also contributes to poor emotional and behavioral health. So you got all that stuff, plus family instability, okay? Families that are poor move a lot. There's a lot more stress. If people don't know where their money's coming from and they're worried about paying the rent and they're worried about their car breaking down, parents have less time and less energy, and they're more irritable and stressed out. Okay, neighborhoods are more dangerous. And as we pointed out, if everybody around you is not doing too well, it's real hard to believe that you can make it. You can do well. And then, of course, physical health, emotional and behavioral health contribute to cognition and education. Plus, lack of personal and family resources. If your family can't buy books, you're not going to have a lot of books. One of the highest correlations of literacy learning, as we talked about when we talked about families, is families that have over 500 books in the home. If you have 100 books in the home, 500 books in the library, okay? But you know what? If you're a person who's scraping for every nickel and dime, and you might be working 2 shifts, one at Walmart and one at some restaurant someplace, you're not going to have time to take your kids to the library. You may not have the car to take your kids to the library. And if you ever tried to use the bus system in Athens, we even have one, it takes about an hour and 15 minutes just to get to the library from where I live on the bus, if you're lucky. And I can just see myself doing that with 3 kids under the age of 5, sure. Okay? And a lot of places don't even have mass transit. So lack of personal and family resources, not internet, again, a big source of literacy. Few neighborhood resources, we talked about. In poor neighborhoods, the libraries are worse. Even the drugstores have fewer books in them, believe it or not. Even the signs have fewer letters on them in poor neighborhoods. That was researched by Susan Newman, and it was amazing. Lower school quality, we don't even have to talk about that. We know that school quality in poor neighborhoods is much less than what is available in the suburbs. That's why people move there for one reason. And again, you get stereotyping. If you don't look like a middle class person, people, even teachers, are not as likely to give you a chance and to think you could do really well. So poverty hugely impacts learning. So we've talked about cultural mismatch. We've talked about poverty. A third very common possible reason for struggles in reading are what are called specific learning disabilities in reading. And I'm not going to go into much detail because two of you are going to look at this specifically, and I don't want to steal your thunder here. But you should know that specific learning disability is a term that is under huge controversy and has been ever since it was originated, okay? Because it describes a problem, it doesn't diagnose it. We talk about a learning disability diagnosis, but it's not a real diagnosis, okay? Because a diagnosis pinpoints the cause of something, and we don't know what causes specific learning disabilities. Probably a lot of different things. So when I say it's a description rather than a diagnosis, what I mean is, here's a really good medical parallel. Okay, if I go to the doctor and I say, oh, my throat hurts, I can hardly talk, and it really hurts to swallow, okay? He'll look at my throat and it'll be all red and it hurts, and he'll do a strep test, right? And if that strep test comes back positive, he'll say, oh, I know what's wrong with you. You have a strep throat. And he'll give me antibiotics and I will feel better in 24 hours or so usually. That's a diagnosis. He knows what's wrong, he knows what's causing it, and he can probably fix it. Not all diagnoses, but a lot of them you can fix. But you know what? If that strep test comes back negative, he's going to say, well, you have pharyngitis, and that's what he'll write on the insurance thing so he can bill the appointment. And he'll say, go home, try to relax, try to rest, don't eat anything that hurts your throat, and, try to rest your throat and see how it goes. Okay, well, you were already doing that, weren't you? You know what pharyngitis means? It's Latin for sore throat. You kind of knew that when you walked in, didn't you? Specific learning disability in reading is exactly like that. Nobody gets tested for specific learning disability if they're already not learning how to read the way we think they should. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. If you've got a kid who's really struggling to read, and it's not due to a low IQ, which can be tested, not terribly accurately, but it can be tested, and it's not due to emotional problems, and it's not due to behavioral issues, because he'll get an EBD, not an SLD, and it's not due to ADHD, and it's not due to autism, and it's not due, and this is the one I love in the law, it's not due to inadequate instruction, which is why we have RTIs, okay? If it's not any of those things, then it is a specific learning disability in reading, and that's how we diagnose those. There isn't a diagnostic test that will tell you, yes, you really have a learning disability in reading. So we don't know what causes them, we can't diagnose them very well, and we don't know exactly what will help kids with SLDs. Probably lots of different things, but I have to tell you there's very little evidence that any scripted program does much good. One of the things we have noticed is that many kids with SLDs have low levels of phonemic awareness. Okay, they have trouble dissecting sounds. Remember, we talked about that way back at the beginning less than a month ago, okay? They have trouble doing the cat, mat, fat, sat thing, okay? But does that mean that's a learning disability in reading, or does that just because that's how we choose to teach reading? We don't really know these things. So I'll let the two people who really look deeper into this talk about them a little more. Whatever the cause of a child's problem in reading, struggling readers often develop some very common symptoms. First of all, they develop misconceptions about reading. Young kids who are struggling to read often believe that reading is all about memorizing the words, even maybe memorizing a whole book. And that is a stage, by the way, on the way to reading. Little children, like 3-4-year-olds, will open a book and they've pretty much memorized it because that somebody's read it to them 1,600 times, and they'll pretend to read the book, and that's normal, that's fine. But when you get a kid, in fact, that's a good thing. But when you get a kid who's 8 or 9, who's memorizing the book, then you've got a problem, don't you? Struggling readers also don't seem to understand a lot of times that small differences make a difference. So they will read all the words that begin with the same set of letters the same. You know, they'll see H and they'll kind of take a guess at it. Is it house or horse or help or hello or whatever? They don't notice middle letters very well at all. And some struggling readers, young ones, don't really understand that how the letter is turned makes a difference. And this is the origin of the myth that kids with dyslexia or specific learning disability in reading reverse letters. No, that's something that all children do when they're very young, like 3 or 4 when they start to copy letters. Because think about it. If you take a D and you just flip it, it becomes a B, doesn't it? But that's not true of most of the things you know in your world. If I take a chair and I turn it around, it's still a chair. If I take a dog and he faces the other way, he's still a dog, isn't he? So you have to learn that letters don't work that way. That if you take a B and you turn it around, it's a D, and you flip it upside down, it's a P. Okay? But struggling readers often, when they're very young, don't develop this understanding of things. And as they get older, they develop what we call maladaptive coping strategies. Okay, not being able to read in our society is really, really bad. Like I said the other day, you'll see people at parties say, oh, well, I just never could handle math. I just let my husband do all my checkbook for me, I'm just not any good at math, and they'll laugh. You will never see a grown-up say, oh, I'm just not any good at reading. I let my husband do all the reading. I've just never been a great reader. Just can't do it. You won't see that. They won't say that at a party casually. They won't let anybody know. Because in our society, reading, the ability to read, is in our minds correlated with intelligence. So if you can't read, we look at you as stupid. And people don't want to be called stupid. Okay, so the first coping strategy that kids and adults who struggle with reading do is they avoid reading. Because, and the one video I am asking you to watch, all of you to watch, is from Children of the Code, and I've given you the website in the optionals. And it's called Reading Shame, and there's some really smart people talking about what it's like not to read, and why when you struggle with reading, you end up in this downward spiral kind of thing. And one of the reasons is you avoid reading. You also cover up the fact you can't read. You make excuses. I didn't have my glasses with me. I didn't have time. If you're a little kid, you say, I hate reading. I don't want to read. You don't say, I can't. You say, I won't. You have other people read to you. And again, how many football players have made it through high school having their girlfriends read everything for them? And you cultivate a non-reading identity, because you can't make reading part of your identity if you can't do it very well. So you decide you're going to be the tough guy who hates school. You're going to be the jock who doesn't bother with reading. You're going to be the techie, who plays video games but doesn't read, although most gamers have to read instructions. And you get peers around you who don't read. You're not going to be best buddies with the best reader in school. You're going to hang out partly because the school has put you in ability groups, which is pretty much not a good idea. You're going to hang out with the other kids who don't read. And so nobody in your group thinks it's normal or fun or interesting to read. In fact, if you came around and sat down with a book, you'd be thought weird. So that really makes a problem, doesn't it? Not being able to read, adults who are illiterate have much higher levels of depression and anxiety. Kids who cannot read, who are struggling to read in school, show much higher levels of behavioral outbursts because you're being asked to do something you can't do, and you're being asked publicly, and everybody knows you can't do it and thinks you're stupid. So, it kind of makes you mad, doesn't it? And depressed and anxious. Okay? And then finally, there are some benefits to not reading. They don't begin to outweigh the benefits of reading. But if you can't read, you kind of notice, okay, my friends can't read and I don't read and I can't read, So I'm part of this group. And if I learn to read and I start to get better at school, I'm not going to have my friends anymore. A couple people did some research and found that they were kids who were, it was adults. There were adults in a reading clinic, and they got attached to the teachers, the tutors at the reading clinic, a couple of very nice looking college girls, and so they didn't want to learn to read too fast. Okay, I don't think that happens much. But you also have lowered expectations. If everybody knows that you can't read very well and you're in the lowest group or you have a disability or whatever, then nobody's going to expect you to read. So you don't fail as often. It's kind of scary to start to try to read, isn't it? These maladaptive behaviors result in something that Keith Stanovich called the Matthew effect in reading. And it's taken from that passage in Matthew 25, one of the scariest parts of the Bible from my point of view, that basically everybody who has gets more, and people who don't have lose more and more. And in reading, it becomes a downward spiral where you struggle with reading, so you avoid reading, and you start to dislike reading, and then because you avoid it and dislike it, you get worse at it, and then you start shutting down in school when they try to teach you to read, and you get worse at it, and you never practice. I mean, not practice, because there's no such thing as really practicing reading, you just read. But if you don't read, you fall further and further and further behind, and you get more and more upset about it, and you get further away from books and reading, and you can kind of see how this whole thing just goes downhill. But it doesn't have to. We can do things. And we're going to talk for a few minutes here about things we can do. One of the best things we can do is scaffold, is support reading. Scaffolding is defined as basically supporting a learner so that the part of the task they can't do, you do for them, or the technology that scaffolding them does for them. We're going to talk about 4 different levels of scaffolding. This is another one of your optionals, okay? It's a handout from a presentation that I did over 10 years ago, but still very solid, and feel free to share it with teachers. Just make sure you leave my name on it so someone else doesn't take it and publish it, okay? But it's called Supporting Struggling Readers in Content Area Literacy. And this is a big problem for teachers. It's a big problem for elementary school teachers, but it's an even bigger problem for middle school and high school teachers. Because by the time a kid gets into middle school, okay, the science teacher feels like they're going to teach science. So they're teaching 7th grade science, and they've got 5 kids in their class who can't read above a 3rd grade level. And the science textbook, as you will see in that handout, is usually written pretty badly and on an even higher than 7th grade level. And so what do? And a lot of teachers I've worked with just throw up their hands and say, well, there's nothing I can do. The kid can't even read the textbook. I'm sure you've heard that. But there's a lot we can do, okay? And here is how we can scaffold those struggling content area learners so that 2 good things happen. One good thing happens is they can learn the content so they don't fall behind in science and social studies and literature as well as basic reading and math, okay? But the second thing that happens is when you scaffold kids, they read more and they get better at it. So you're not taking away their reading, you're actually giving them a chance to read better. Okay, but you can't sit in 7th grade and wait for the kid to gain 4 grade levels in reading before you teach him 7th grade science or history, okay? So what can you do? And as I said, there's a handout in there with just a whole bunch of strategies, gallons of strategies listed. And I actually do a whole professional development for schools on this, for middle school and high schools, on how to scaffold struggling readers, because teachers are at their wits' end. Okay, level 1, share some strategies with them. Teach them some strategies. Honestly, rather than just teaching the strategies, you're better off helping kids to share strategies for reading with each other, because kids then become strategic. So you and I both know there's all kinds of strategies that help you read. And this is level 1 for the kid who's just a little behind, you know? Maybe they're in 7th grade science and they read maybe at a 5th, 6th grade level, okay? Well, some reading strategies will help them a lot. Some highlighting, some technology can really help. You can use Outline in Word to help you outline articles. It'll shift it to an outline view. There's all kinds of little things you can do that you and I both know lots of those strategies, and there's a ton of them, concept mapping, visualization, all this stuff that you can help kids learn. And like I said, the best way to help kids learn that stuff is not to teach them a strategy, because then they'll learn the strategy, but they won't use it. Let them share strategies with each other, and you sometimes share what you do when something's hard for you. Level 2, kid who struggles a little more, maybe gets some extra support, but using regular materials and assignments. And one of those supports we'll see when we look at ebooks in a second is you can give kids pre-highlighted text so that the most important stuff is highlighted. Ebooks are wonderful. We're going to look at more and more of it. You can help them pre-learn words. You can give them resources to find words and get words pronounced. You can give them, like if you give kids, if a science teacher gives kids an assignment to read a chapter and pull out the 5 main ideas, well, maybe for some kids he gives them a couple sentence starters for those main ideas, okay? Or he gives them a structure that they can start to fill in. Some extra support, okay? Level 3, this is the kid who's really struggling. You might need to offer some alternative texts. Alternative texts, and I have them in quotes because they can be a lot of things, and this is where the library is so helpful, and we've talked about that. If you're teaching a 7th grade unit on volcanoes, well, there's probably some 3rd and 4th grade books around about volcanoes that would help that kid. And so you find some lower level books. If you're teaching literature, you can find classic comics for classics. You can find abridged versions. You can find simplified versions. I showed you before Wikipedia, Simple Wikipedia, wonderful thing. You can look up anything and Wikipedia will take it down to a lower grade level for a middle schooler or a high schooler. Alternative texts are also films. If I'm going to teach Romeo and Juliet, I'm sure as heck going to show the film first, because that gives kids a scaffolding to build their understanding of the play on. They already kind of know the story and who the people are, so it really helps them read the play. So lots of things can be texts, okay? Even games could be texts. And finally, for the kid who really struggles, really struggles, you can do co-reading or apprentice reading. And apprentice reading is one of your optionals. It is a method of working with struggling elementary school kids that I have done a lot of research on. I gave you the handout from my recent AERA 2016 presentation, okay? And in there are the results of 8 small n studies showing statistically significant effects. It's a way of partner reading with kids. I introduced it to you at the beginning here with the one librarian who was one of the 8 studies, okay? But this one gives you the whole summary. And if that's something you are interested in doing in your school, I am more than happy to help. Apprentice reading can be done with reading partners who are volunteers. It can be done with parents. I've done 2 studies with parents, and these were not highly reading parents, and it went wonderfully. Okay, it can be done with, we haven't done studies, but I have seen it used in schools that I was helping successfully with older kids and younger kids. So there's a lot of possibilities there. If I did buddy reading with struggling readers, that's how I do it, is apprentice reading. Not just buddy, but this way. And co-reading in other ways. You can use audiobooks and have kids read along. You can, again, use ebooks, because ebooks can turn into audiobooks. We're going to talk about that. But what I really want to say is, yes, we have this problem with struggling readers, and Lord knows it's hard to teach them, but it's not hopeless. There are so many things we can do and try. Okay, now we're going to get to talk about ebooks. Look at my kitty in the corner there who's saying, why are ebooks so good for struggling readers? I couldn't resist the cat. Okay, well, there's a lot of reasons. Ebooks are awesome for struggling readers. First of all, nobody knows what you're reading. That's huge. If I am a struggling 6th grader and I need to read Frog and Toad, I'm not carrying that book around. I'm hoping people find something a little better for me to read, but Frog and Toad ain't so bad. I like them. There's Dr. Seuss, that's awesome. Okay, but I'm not carrying a baby book around. If I'm carrying a Kindle, nobody knows. You can make the letters bigger. And oddly enough, making the letters bigger really does help some struggling readers. You can also make the letters different colors. You can do white on black. Normally that doesn't help people, but you know, some struggling readers it does. We don't know why. Probably something about their visual range or something, but it helps. Okay? Um, so another thing you can do, we talked about pre-highlighting. That's very easy to do in an ebook, but you can also share highlights. Different kids can highlight in different colors, which is awesome. And you can see, well, why did they highlight that? Oh, I think that would be good. And then we get to the really fun stuff. Okay, this is the new feature on the Kindle, where not only can you click on a word and have it defined for you, but you can take a level of definitional help that you want to go all the way through the text. See it down here in the bottom left, where all the difficult words, and you can choose your level, how difficult, are defined in simple words above. So abnormal is defined as not normal. And it says, so it came about, and it says to happen. I was unjustly accused, not fairly, or not, I can't read that. But anyway, so that will be all the way through the text, and you can turn that on and help your struggling readers. Talk about a scaffold. And of course, the last biggie is that in almost all ebook programs now, you can simply touch the word and they'll say it for you. So if you can't read the word, if you're reading along and you're reading they shuffle, shuff, you can just touch it and it'll say shuffled. And that is awesome. And if worse comes to worse, you can highlight the whole paragraph and it'll read it to you. You can highlight the whole book and it'll read it to you. So ebooks are amazing. Okay? And one of your optionals is a lists of places to get free ebooks, which is something you'll want to share with your teachers and your parents, and you'll want to have as a librarian. Okay, so I've been talking about all these optionals. Wow, there are so many great optionals. And before I talk about the optionals, I want to point out that in your instructions for this time, what you're going to be doing is reading the one article I send you about the population you picked out, and then you're going to find another resource and share it with all of us, okay? So that's your main reading, and then just that one little reading shame video I wanted you to watch, okay? It's like, I don't know, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that, short. But here are some optionals. An article, a real good all-around nice article to read if you want to get a little further into especially middle school, is by Mayan. It's called Erica's Stories, Literacy Solutions for a Failing Middle School Student. There is the handout on apprentice reading. Again, read it or share it or whatever, but if it's something you might want to do in your school, maybe for your project for this workshop, feel free to look at it. Newman and Solano, I talked about Don't Level the Field, about poverty. Icero, We Kindle a Love of Reading. This is a teacher who wrote an article about how he used Kindles with his struggling readers. Great article. Old article by Steve Krashen, the guy we've already looked at, and Jeff McQuillan, called Once a Good Reader. 1998, but still really good, talking about the fact that there is no critical period for learning reading, and this is a fact you need to know, even if you don't read that article right now. It's a good article. I enjoy it. People enjoy it. But the fact is that if you are a 7th grader who read at a 3rd grade level, if you start reading a lot and you take off, it's not going to take you 4 years to catch up. There is no, once you become a good reader, it doesn't matter that you weren't before. We have this sort of myth that everybody makes a year's progress, so if you're 4 years behind, my gosh, you're doomed. No, you're not. There's a lot of people, and that's what Krashen and McQuillan are writing about. Lots of famous people, lots of well-known people, lots of not so well-known people who do really badly in reading and then suddenly catch it. And they start reading like mad and they catch right up. So that's important. There's a TED Talk by Molinari, and it should only be one L there, I'm sorry. It's LF Molinari, who's talking about the digital divide and how that's impacting people, the fact that there's so little access in rural areas, in poor areas, and that's making a huge difference because the internet, of course, is the site of the latest literacy. If you can't get to the internet and you don't read things online, you're falling behind, aren't you? And then the video, Reading Shame, that you watched is from the Children of the Code website, which is all about reading. Now, do I agree with everything on that website? No, I don't. They place a lot of emphasis on decoding that I think is a little too strong. But that's okay. They have a lot of great resources and great talks and great people. Okay, and here's some to more great resources, but especially to share with teachers. I wanted to give you stuff to share with teachers. We already talked about strategies for supporting struggling readers in content area learning. That is literally a handout with gallons of strategies that teachers can try to support kids who don't read that well. Not to teach them to read, because we don't have time for that, but they will learn to read better while they're learning their science or their social studies or their math, okay? There's a video if you're interested in sharing with teachers the impact of poverty, not specifically on reading. This is not about reading, but there's a video, two videos done by 60 Minutes, one in 2002 and one in 2000, I think it was 13, one in 2001 and one in 2013, called Tammy's Story and Tammy's Story 13 Years Later. They're shortish videos, less than 10 minutes. Again, when I go and do professional development in a school about poverty, I start with these videos because they will knock you back. Don't watch them if you're depressed. Okay? Just wait till you're a little cheerful. There's another video, Wealth Distribution in America, an amazing 6-minute video. I mentioned it already, about why things are so unequal. What's going on here? The article by Templeton, Why is That Child So Rude?, helps us understand cultural differences in schools and how sometimes kids are not trying to be rude or difficult or anything, but their cultural dissonance with the school just is making it tough. Here's one we didn't talk about. I threw it in here only because this seemed like where it fit, but it's something that I try to share with every group that I teach. In your schools, every day, you meet kids who are considering suicide. As young as 9 years old, 10 years old, there's a substantial number. Over 16% of high school kids have said they seriously considered suicide. Suicide is in fact one of the leading killers of teens from 12 to 20. Okay? It's not a cheerful topic. It's something teachers are not educated what to do about. And I'm not trying to take that on. I put it here because very often struggling in school is one of the reasons kids consider suicide. That and peer relationships, as you know, are the biggie. But I think it's real important to share with people what you can do. And I used to work on a suicide hotline. I volunteered on a suicide hotline. And the tips in that suicide prevention resources are straight from the main websites that are listed at the end, that are government sanctioned, well known. And it's just sort of oh my God, what do I do? You know, and honestly, I teach here at the university. When I was responsible for the 350 person class of undergraduates, we had in this 13 sections, but it was all one class that was being offered. Every semester we would have 1, 2, 3 kids who were potential suicide risks. And I would make sure they got to help. We never lost one so far. In 19 years, we didn't lose one. And that's not because I did things. I mean, a lot of them would have made it. But, you know, it's just something people should know about. So there it is for you. There's a list of free ebook sites to get free ebooks on, and a list of lists, places to get high-low books. I didn't mention high-low books. High-low books are books written at a higher age interest than the reading level is. So the Bluford High boys books, the Bluford High books, if you've read them, are probably the classic example of high-low books. They're topics that middle schoolers and high schoolers would be very interested in. Books that are high interest, very well written actually, I liked them. but they're written at about a third or fourth grade level, okay? So high interest, low reading level, that's a high-low book. And you need a gap of about 2 to 3 years in reading level for them to be high-low books. And there's a whole lists of places to find those. Some are better than others, but there's resources for you. You should make sure you have some high-low books in your library. You know, books that are on higher, maybe if you're an elementary school librarian, you want books that fourth and fifth graders are going to be real interested in that are written at a second grade level, okay? If you're in a middle school, books that middle schoolers are going to be interested in, written at third and fourth grade levels. If you're at a high school, and none of you are, but high school libraries need to have books in them that high school kids are going to really be interested in, cover the topics they're interested in, the kind of stories they're interested in, but they're written at maybe a fifth grade level, maybe a sixth grade level tops. Anyway, so you've got all those. So that's it for this time. Thank you all. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday.